My new vice president pointed at the door and dared me to walk out, bragging he would close the $80 million energy deal by himself. He had no idea the state legally required a Tier 1 certification to sign, a license only I held. I did not argue. I just went home and signed the entire contract under my own consulting firm at 3 in the morning. Let him explain that missing $80 million to the board. Hello and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. We truly appreciate you taking the time to listen today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep producing these episodes for you. If you enjoy today's story and want to help us survive, please consider joining our Patreon, where you can listen to exclusive, even better true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube, which you can access by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the Patreon link in the description or comments below. Now, let us dive into today's story, starting with my name, Avery Bennett. I am 34 years old and hold the title of Lead Environmental Systems Architect at Novus Terra Energy, a fictionalized name for a very real, very cutthroat renewable energy conglomerate based in Chicago. In the corporate ecosystem, my job description essentially translates to being the highly paid janitor for legal and technical disasters. I am the one who wades into the murky swamps of zoning laws, environmental impact studies, and structural engineering compliance that the executives in the top offices are too terrified or simply too incompetent to touch. For the past 14 months, my entire existence was consumed by a beast we called Project Helios. This was not some minor installation. Project Helios was an $80 million contract bid to completely modernize the energy storage grid for the state of Illinois. It was a labyrinth of regulatory nightmares. It required absolute, surgical precision regarding environmental protection standards and urban planning laws. One misplaced decimal point in a soil degradation report, and the state would throw the entire bid into the shredder. I lived and breathed Helios, while the board of directors spent their days enjoying catered lunches and imagining their year-end bonuses. I was the one down in the trenches. I personally negotiated the labor agreements with the union engineers. I drafted every single blueprint for the high-voltage substations. I spent hundreds of hours arguing with city planners to secure the most sensitive, highly restricted permits the state had to offer. I built the $80 million foundation of this project with my own two hands, brick by agonizing brick. Then, the era of peace abruptly ended. The company decided we needed fresh leadership to push Helios across the finish line, which was corporate speak for hiring someone to take all the credit. Enter Sterling Vance. Sterling was our newly appointed Vice President of Strategic Development. If you looked up the definition of corporate parasite in a dictionary, you would find a picture of Sterling flashing his perfectly bleached teeth. He was a slick, tailored suit, masquerading as a human being. The man spoke exclusively in hollow buzzwords, like synergy, paradigm shift, and agile integration. I quickly realized that Sterling was vastly more skilled at playing 18 holes of golf at his private country club than he was at reading a basic technical report. He did not know the difference between a lithium-ion containment protocol and a toaster oven, but he possessed an unearned confidence that only comes from a lifetime of failing upward. It did not take long for Sterling to mark his territory. Right out of the gate, during his very first week on the job, he initiated what he called a strategic team realignment. What that actually meant was completely dismantling the command structure I had built, without a word of warning. I suddenly found my name mysteriously dropped from all the critical client email threads. The direct line of communication I had established with the State Planning Board over 14 months was severed. When I checked the new organizational chart, Sterling had unilaterally reassigned me. The architect of the entire project was now listed under administrative paperwork support. He was systematically boxing me out of my own creation, preparing to stand on the podium and claim Project Helios as his exclusive triumph. A lesser person might have marched straight into the Human Resources Department, slamming fists on desks and demanding justice. But I have survived in the toxic wasteland of corporate America long enough to know that human resources exist solely to protect the company, not the employees. A complaint would only label me as difficult to work with and accelerate my termination. I knew exactly what Sterling was doing. He was squeezing the lemon dry and preparing to throw away the rind. The resentment burned hot in my chest, a heavy, suffocating weight, but I forced it down into a cold, hard knot. I chose the path of absolute silence. I smiled at Sterling in the hallways. I nodded during his pointless presentations. I retreated to my cubicle and quietly did the busy work he assigned me. But beneath that compliant surface, I was watching his every move. I was taking notes, saving documents, and letting the incompetent fool dig his own grave while I quietly held the shovel. The calendar notification popped up on my screen on a Tuesday morning. It was the final, critical presentation with the Illinois State Planning Board, the exact meeting where we were supposed to lock down the operational timeline and finalize the initial funding release. I had prepared the slide deck for this specific presentation for 3 weeks. I clicked the link to join the secure digital conference room, only to be met with a stark red error message indicating my access had been explicitly revoked by the host. A quick, sharp message to Sterling yielded a swift, agonizingly condescending reply a few minutes later. "I am taking the lead on this one today, Avery," he typed, his words practically dripping with unearned superiority. "You are a bit too rigid with the compliance regulations. We need someone with actual commercial vision to close the deal and get them to sign, not an engineer who quotes legal codes at the client and slows down the momentum. Sit this one out." I stared at the glowing monitor, my blood slowly turning to ice. Commercial vision. That is what he called his reckless arrogance. I called it walking blindfolded into a regulatory minefield with a live grenade in his hand. I did not have to wait long to hear the deafening explosion. In the highly regulated, intensely scrutinized world of municipal energy storage, there are unbreakable commandments that you simply do not violate. You do not cut corners on thermal runaway containment protocols, and you absolutely never, ever attempt to bypass a mandatory environmental impact assessment. The state of Illinois requires a grueling, multi-phase ecological study for any grid-level battery deployment to ensure toxic heavy metals and reactive chemicals do not leach into the public groundwater supply during a catastrophic system failure. It is a non-negotiable legal shield. But Sterling, in his infinite corporate wisdom and desperate, sweating hunger to secure a faster payout to impress the top brass, decided those federal and state laws were merely inconvenient suggestions. During the pitch, attempting to dazzle the veteran commissioners with a miraculously reduced timeline and a lower upfront capital cost, he made a fatal promise. He confidently guaranteed the board that we would utilize a newly sourced, significantly cheaper composite battery material from an unvetted overseas supplier to make the timeline work. He flashed his brightest smile and assured the state regulators that this mystery material was somehow already pre-approved, boldly stating that we could skip the Phase 3 environmental review entirely. He promised them this would effectively shave 6 months off the construction schedule and save them millions. He thought he was being a maverick disruptor. He thought he was a genius negotiator pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Instead, he had just profoundly insulted the intelligence of the most relentless, legally strict regulatory body in the entire Midwest. The blowback was instantaneous and brutally destructive. The planning board did not just politely reject his revised proposal. They viewed his pitch as a blatant, insulting, and potentially criminal attempt to defraud the state. They immediately assumed Novus Terra Energy was operating in bad faith, trying to sneak a substandard, environmentally hazardous ticking time bomb past their watch to pad our profit margins. By 2 o'clock that exact afternoon, the State Commission had issued a formal, scathing notice of grievance. Much worse than that, they enacted a total and absolute communication freeze. Every single phone number at the state office rang through to generic voicemail. Every email address associated with the planning board bounced back with an automated rejection. They built an impenetrable legal fortress wall around the $80 million contract, and we were entirely locked on the outside. Raw panic swept through the executive floor of our building like a rapidly spreading wildfire. The chief executive officer, a man who had likely already mentally spent his projected quarterly bonus on a new yacht, began breathing pure fire down Sterling's neck. The Golden Boy executive had managed to completely alienate our most lucrative government client in less than 45 minutes of talking. The financial pressure to fix the unmitigated disaster was immense, and the terrified upper management immediately demanded a head on a silver platter to appease the state. A coward never owns his catastrophic mistakes. He instinctively redirects the blame to the nearest convenient target. I knew Sterling would panic when the walls closed in, but I genuinely underestimated the sheer, sociopathic audacity of his self-preservation instincts. Late Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting quietly at my desk, meticulously organizing old compliance files, when my personal cell phone vibrated violently. It was an encrypted text message from Sarah, a close friend of mine who worked as a senior financial analyst. Her desk was located directly adjacent to the executive boardroom on the top floor. "Meet me in the basement coffee shop right now," the message read. "Do not tell a single soul where you are going." When I arrived in the dim basement, Sarah looked physically sick, her face entirely drained of color. Her hands were shaking as she slid a printed copy of a highly confidential internal memo across the small table. I read the bold header. It was a formal incident mitigation report, authored directly by Sterling Vance, addressed to the Chief Executive Officer and the entire Board of Directors. In the 3-page document, Sterling spun a masterful, utterly fictitious web of lies. He stated that the disastrous pitch meeting was the direct result of, quote, grossly misleading technical documents and severely faulty compliance summaries provided to me by lead architect Avery Bennett. He outright lied, claiming I had explicitly assured him in private that the cheaper battery materials were fully vetted and entirely exempt from the standard environmental impact assessments. He concluded the memo by formally recommending my immediate termination with cause, offering me up as a sacrificial lamb to supposedly salvage the shattered relationship with the state planning board. I sat in the basement and stared at the paper, reading the lies over and over. It was a perfectly executed, cold-blooded frame job. He was going to feed me to the wolves to save his shiny vice president title and his corner office. The sheer, unadulterated rage that washed over my entire body was not hot, loud, or explosive. It was freezing, absolute zero cold. He actually thought I was just a naive, disposable paper pusher who would quietly take the fall and disappear into the night. He had absolutely no idea what kind of monster he had just unchained. The summons came precisely at 6 o'clock in the evening. By that hour, the sprawling bullpen outside my cubicle had completely emptied out, leaving only the low mechanical hum of the air conditioning unit and the faint glow of the Chicago skyline bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked down the deserted hallway toward the executive wing, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. When I stepped into Sterling's office, he did not even offer me a seat. He stood behind his massive mahogany desk, his tie loosened, his face flushed with a mixture of manufactured outrage and underlying panic. Before I could even fully cross the threshold, he picked up the 2-inch-thick Helios project binder and violently hurled it across the room. It slammed onto the glass surface of the coffee table with a sound like a gunshot, papers spilling onto the floor. "You are a complete disaster, Avery," he hissed, slamming his hands down on his desk. "I just spent the last 4 hours doing damage control with the chief executive officer because of your sheer incompetence. You fed me garbage data. You intentionally overloaded my briefing with outdated zoning restrictions and completely failed to mention the structural alternatives. You made me look like an absolute fool in front of the commission, and you are going to take the heat for this." He was building his narrative, performing for an audience of one, cementing the lies he had already written in his secret memo. He wanted me to cower. He wanted me to cry, to beg for my job, to apologize profusely so he could formally document my confession of guilt. Instead, I stood perfectly still. The suffocating weight of 14 months of biting my tongue simply evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, predatory clarity. I looked at the scattered papers on the floor, then looked him dead in the eyes. "I did not give you garbage data. Sterling," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I gave you a bulletproof, legally binding framework, and you decided to set it on fire to look like a hero. You did not just insult the State Planning Board today, you actively violated the State Land Protection Act of 2004. His jaw tightened, a momentary flash of confusion breaking through his anger. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. "When you promised them that cheap overseas battery composite, you legally committed Novus Terra Energy to a Class 3 hazardous material deployment. That requires a mandatory subterranean containment shell. You told the board we could skip the Phase 3 assessment, which means you essentially confessed to a premeditated breach of federal environmental law on a recorded state conference call. The board did not freeze us out because they were annoyed. They froze us out because they are currently deciding whether or not to recommend you for criminal corporate fraud." The color completely drained from his face, replaced rapidly by a violently dark shade of crimson. I had stripped away his buzzwords, leaving him naked in his own staggering ignorance. I had hit the exact nerve that terrified him the most, exposing the reality that he had no idea what he was actually managing. Driven into a corner, his ego completely shattered, Sterling lost whatever remaining shred of professional composure he possessed. He stormed around the desk, stopping mere inches from me. He pointed his index finger directly into my face, his hand shaking with uncontrollable rage. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are nothing. You are just an overpaid map drawer. You sit in a cubicle and color inside the lines while people like me actually build this company. If you think you are so brilliant, if you think you are so utterly irreplaceable, then walk out that door, get out of my building. Let us see what you can actually do without my funding and my network. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to call the state. I am going to fix your catastrophic mess. And I will close this $80 million contract entirely by myself." Silence descended heavily upon the room. He breathed heavily, waiting for my counterattack, bracing for a shouting match. But I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at his trembling finger, and then I smiled. It was a small, chilling smile. A smile that made the temperature in the room feel like it plummeted straight to freezing. "All right, Sterling," I replied softly, my tone completely serene. "Good luck with your commercial vision." I did not wait for his response. I turned on my heel and walked out the door. The rhythmic click of my shoes echoing down the empty corridor. I left him standing alone in his massive office, panting and gloating in his hollow victory, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just handed me the shovel and asked me to dig his grave. I drove back to my apartment with the windows rolled down, letting the freezing Chicago wind bite at my face. The city lights blurred past me, a neon reflection of the absolute chaos I knew was currently unfolding in Sterling's office. While he was frantically trying to figure out how to salvage a burned bridge, I was mentally preparing to detonate the entire foundation he stood upon. The moment I walked through my front door, the corporate facade dropped completely. I did not bother turning on the main lights. I walked straight to the kitchen, brewed a pot of the strongest dark roast coffee I had, and sat down at my personal workstation. I did not log into the Novus Terra Energy Secure Network. Their servers were thoroughly compromised by Sterling's panicked damage control. Instead, I bypassed their system entirely and logged directly into the highly restricted, encrypted internal portal of the Illinois State Planning Board, using my personal federal access credentials. There is a fundamental truth about corporate executives that people like Sterling constantly prove. They love executive summaries, slide decks, and bullet points. They absolutely despise reading the actual contractual literature. The Helios bid was a massive 800-page labyrinth of technical specifications and regulatory requirements. Sterling had merely skimmed the first 10 pages. If he had bothered to read exactly down to page 42, he would have discovered a very quiet, deeply buried federal mandate. Because the grid modernization involved emergency federal funds, The state required a very specific type of signature to bind the contract. The lead signatory could not just be a corporate officer. The law explicitly stated the project director must hold a valid, active Tier 1 federal sustainability engineer certification. It is an incredibly grueling credential to acquire, requiring specialized exams, years of fieldwork, and a flawless security clearance. Here was the beautiful, devastating twist. Novus Terra Energy, as a corporate entity, did not own that certification. The chief executive officer did not have one. Sterling certainly did not have one. In the entire Chicago office of our multi-million-dollar conglomerate, there was exactly one person who possessed a Tier 1 license: me. The license was permanently attached to my personal federal identification number. By demanding I walk out the door, Sterling had not just fired his lead architect, he had actively thrown the only key that could legally unlock the $80 million vault into the garbage. But the federal certification was only the first piece of the puzzle. I needed the blueprints, the highly sensitive zoning maps, and the structural integrity reports I had spent 14 months building. According to standard corporate doctrine, everything created on company time is company property. However, corporate lawyers are often lazy when they draft standard employment agreements for mid-level engineers. When I was hired exactly 5 years ago, the legal department handed me a generic boilerplate contract. Being naturally paranoid, I had carefully read every single line before signing it. Buried deep in the intellectual property section was a poorly phrased loophole originally designed to protect the company from liability on abandoned projects. The clause stated that if the company formally rejected an infrastructure design or failed to utilize it within a period of 30 days, the intellectual property rights automatically reverted back to the original creator, allowing them to register the design independently. By throwing my binder across the room and officially overriding my blueprints during his disastrous conference call, Sterling had explicitly, formally rejected my work on the record. He had categorized my compliance structures as garbage data. In doing so, he unknowingly activated the 30-day reversion clause. The entire blueprint for Project Helios was no longer the legal property of Novus Terra Energy. It belonged entirely to me. The digital clock on my monitor glowed bright red, reading 11 o'clock at night. The heist had officially begun. For the next 4 hours, the only sound in my dark apartment was the rapid, rhythmic clatter of my mechanical keyboard. I systematically opened every single file, every schematic, every environmental impact assessment. I methodically stripped away the sleek, corporate Novus Terra Energy logos. I deleted Sterling's name from the executive summaries. In their place, I inserted the minimalist header of an independent consulting firm I had quietly incorporated 2 years prior for tax purposes. The firm was called Bennett Dynamics. I was not just editing documents, I was surgically extracting an $80 million infrastructure project from the belly of a massive corporation and transplanting it into a company consisting of one single employee. I double-checked every single technical parameter, ensuring my original, flawless environmental compliance protocols were front and center. I highlighted the exact Phase 3 assessment guarantees that Sterling had recklessly tried to bypass, proving to the state that my design was legally bulletproof and ecologically secure. By 3 in the morning, my coffee cup was completely empty, and the new proposal was perfectly assembled. It was a masterpiece of regulatory engineering. I compiled the massive file into a heavily encrypted data packet. I did not send it to the general submission inbox, where it would be reviewed by low-level clerks. I drafted a direct, highly secure email to Commissioner Marcus Thorne, the head of the State Planning Board. Over the last 14 months of intense negotiations, Marcus and I had developed a deep mutual respect. He despised corporate doublespeak just as much as I did. He trusted my math. He trusted my ethics, and most importantly, he knew I never made a promise I could not keep. I attached the newly branded Bennett Dynamics proposal and typed a very brief, professional message. Commissioner Thorne, attached is the fully compliant, Phase 3 secured blueprint for the grid modernization project. As you will notice, I am now operating independently. I guarantee execution within the original legal parameters. I moved my mouse over the send button. I thought about Sterling screaming in my face. I thought about the chief executive officer preparing to fire me to save his own skin. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs, and clicked send. The progress bar flashed across the screen, confirming the data packet had securely reached the state server. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now, all I had to do was wait for the sun to rise and watch the explosion. The sun rose over the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the corporate park. I arrived at the Novus Terra Energy building precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning, my usual start time. I swiped my keycard at the front turnstile, the familiar electronic chirp echoing in the marble lobby. I stepped onto the elevator, surrounded by the usual crowd of sleep-deprived junior analysts and anxious middle managers, all completely unaware of the tectonic shift that had occurred while they were sleeping. My pulse was perfectly steady. My mind was entirely clear. I walked into the Environmental Systems Department, set my briefcase down, and headed straight for the break room. I took my time grinding the beans and pulling a double shot of espresso. The rich, dark aroma filled the small space, a grounding sensation amidst the sterile, fluorescent-lit environment. Returning to my cubicle, I did not log into my workstation. I did not check my corporate emails. Instead, I pulled a small, flat-packed cardboard box from beneath my desk, unfolded it, and began the quiet, meticulous process of erasing my physical footprint from the company. I worked in absolute silence. I wrapped my favorite ceramic coffee mug in a spare sweater. I packed the framed photograph of my dog, my personal collection of mechanical pencils, and a small potted succulent I had kept alive for 3 years. I did not touch the Helios project binders. Those belonged to the company, even if the intellectual property inside them no longer did. A few rows over, the atmosphere was entirely different. Sterling Vance was putting on a theatrical performance for the entire open plan office. He was pacing back and forth near the water cooler, his suit jacket unbuttoned, holding a green detox smoothie in one hand while gesturing wildly with the other. He had gathered a small audience of wide-eyed summer interns and junior associates, basking in their undivided attention. "It is all about controlling the narrative, guys," Sterling projected his voice loudly, ensuring everyone in a 50-foot radius could hear him. "When you are dealing with government bureaucrats, you cannot let them dictate the pace. They got a little spooked yesterday." "Sure, but I have an emergency video conference scheduled with the state chairman at noon today. I am going to smooth ruffled feathers, pivot the compliance strategy, and bring that $80 million home by the end of the day. You just have to know how to play the game at the highest level." I took a slow sip of my espresso, listening to his arrogant monologue. He genuinely believed his own delusions. He actually thought a slick apology and a bright smile could magically erase a documented federal violation. The digital clock on my desk phone slowly ticked forward. 9:58, 9:59. Exactly at 10 o'clock in the morning. The heavy silence of my cubicle was shattered by the sharp, ringing tone of my direct secure line. I placed my ceramic cup down, let it ring twice for good measure, and picked up the receiver. "Avery Bennett speaking," I said smoothly. "Avery, it is Commissioner Thorne." The deep, gravelly voice of the head of the State Planning Board came through the speaker. I could hear the distinct sound of a heavy stamp hitting a desk in the background. "I received your encrypted packet at 3 in the morning. I had my top legal clerks reviewing the structural integrity reports and the Phase 3 environmental guarantees since sunrise." "And the verdict, Commissioner?" I asked quietly. "The verdict is that your new company, Bennett Dynamics, does exceptionally flawless work," Thorne chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "The blueprints are 100% compliant, the federal safety mandates are perfectly met, and most importantly, your Tier 1 license is fully verified and active. The state is authorizing the immediate release of the initial funding." He paused, and his tone shifted, becoming noticeably colder. "I am going to be entirely honest with you, Avery. After that disastrous stunt your vice president tried to pull yesterday, My board was prepared to blacklist Novus Terra Energy from every municipal contract in Illinois for the next decade. We refuse to work with that suited clown for 1 single second longer, but we trust you. We trust your math. We are signing the deal exclusively with your independent firm. I appreciate your trust, Marcus, I replied, a genuine smile touching my lips. I will oversee the construction personally. The federal system is generating your confirmation right now, Thorne said. Congratulations, Director Bennett. The line clicked dead. A fraction of a second later, my personal encrypted tablet, resting quietly beside my keyboard, chimed. It was an automated notification from the federal contract portal. The digital file had arrived. I opened the document, my eyes scanning the heavily formatted legal text. There it was, printed in bold, undeniable black and white. The total contract valuation was $80 million. The legally binding primary contractor was officially listed as Bennett Dynamics, represented solely by Avery Bennett. I scrolled down to the execution clause. Novus Terra Energy, the massive multi-million-dollar corporation that had employed me just 24 hours ago, was now explicitly designated as a Tier 2 subcontractor. They were legally bound to execute the physical construction entirely under my strict oversight, stripped of all decision-making power, and subjected to a radically reduced profit margin that I would dictate. I wirelessly routed the document to the heavy-duty executive printer at the end of the hall. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt, and walked deliberately toward the machine. The printer whirred to life, spitting out 30 pages of dense legal framework. I waited for the final page, the execution sheet bearing the bright red, digitally authenticated seal of the state of Illinois. I gathered the warm, freshly printed pages and slipped them neatly into a luxurious black leather presentation binder I had brought from home. Holding the heavy binder against my chest, I walked slowly back down the main corridor. I passed right by Sterling. He was still holding court, currently explaining the concept of corporate synergy to an intern who looked desperately bored. He did not even glance in my direction as I walked right past him, a ghost moving through his kingdom. I bypassed my cubicle and walked straight up to the executive suite. The chief executive officer was currently locked in his massive corner office, likely pacing a hole in the carpet while waiting for Sterling's fictional noon phone call to save the company. His senior executive secretary, an older woman named Margaret, sat at the front reception desk, aggressively typing on her keyboard. I stopped at her desk and gently placed the premium black leather binder right in the center of her workspace. Margaret looked up, slightly annoyed by the interruption. "Can I help you?" "Avery, he is not taking any meetings today. We are in the middle of a massive crisis." "I know," I said, my voice soft, polite, and colder than the Chicago winter outside. "Please give this binder directly to the board of directors. It contains the fully executed state contract." "Oh," and Margaret. She blinked, staring at the thick leather folder. "Yes. Tell Human Resources I formally resign," I said, effective immediately. I turned around, walked over to the executive elevator, and pressed the down button. The stainless steel doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped inside, turned to face the executive floor one last time, and watched the doors slowly slide shut. I did not look back. I did not have to be inside the building to know exactly how the explosion went down. My friend Sarah from finance, whose desk sat right outside the boardroom, gave me the play-by-play later that evening. At exactly 2:00 in the afternoon, the emergency meeting of the board of directors was officially called to order. Sterling confidently strolled through the double mahogany doors, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, completely ready to feed the executives a fabricated story. He fully intended to report that the client was merely reconsidering their options and that he had the entire situation firmly under his masterful control. He barely got to his assigned seat before the chief executive officer stood up. The room was dead silent. The chief executive officer did not yell. Instead, he picked up the heavy black leather binder I had left with his secretary and violently slammed it onto the center of the massive conference table. The head of the corporate legal department, a man who usually looked like he had not slept in a decade, nervously opened the binder and began to read the terms aloud. Sarah said you could actually hear the oxygen being sucked out of the room. The legal counsel confirmed the absolute nightmare scenario for the executives sitting at that table. The $80 million project had indeed been fully signed, sealed, and legally approved by the state of Illinois. However, Novus Terra Energy was no longer the sole owner or the primary contractor. The entire corporation had been legally demoted to a secondary subcontractor. They were now legally obligated to execute the physical construction entirely under the strict, uncompromising directives of Bennett Dynamics, and they would be forced to split the profits according to whatever laws and margins Avery Bennett decided to impose. When Sterling heard my name, all the blood instantly drained from his face. He collapsed back into his leather chair, his arrogant posture completely dissolving. In that horrifying moment, the sheer weight of his own stupidity finally crushed him. He realized the fatal legal loophole he had personally activated by formally throwing my binder across his office, explicitly rejecting my structural blueprints, and daring me to walk out the door. He had legally authenticated my right to seize the entire project. He handed me the keys to the kingdom because his ego was too massive to understand the contracts his own company utilized. Chaos erupted. Several board members demanded immediate legal retaliation. They screamed about filing a massive lawsuit against me for corporate espionage and breach of contract, but the exhausted head of the legal department quickly shut them down, delivering the final, devastating blow. He explained that if the company fired Sterling, they would suffer massive public humiliation, but they would survive. However, if they attempted to sue me, the state of Illinois would immediately cancel the entire $80 million fund due to a direct violation of the required operational licensing. I held the only Tier 1 federal credential. I was utterly untouchable. If they fought me, they lost everything. If they surrendered to me, they at least got to keep a small fraction of the money. The chief executive officer turned his furious gaze upon Sterling, the golden boy, the slick vice president of strategic development, tried to stammer out a defense, trying to use his empty corporate buzzwords one last time, but the chief executive officer had heard enough. He exploded into a blind rage. He did not wait for human resources. He did not offer a severance package. He picked up the boardroom telephone, called the front lobby, and demanded the immediate presence of building security. 2 heavy-set security guards marched into the boardroom, right there, in front of the most powerful people in the company. They aggressively stripped the corporate access badge directly off Sterling's lapel. They grabbed him by the arms and physically marched him out of the executive suite, down the elevator, and straight through the crowded main floor. Sarah said the entire office went completely silent. Hundreds of employees watching in shock as the arrogant vice president was thrown out the glass front doors into the broad daylight, banished from the industry forever. Late that afternoon, I was sitting comfortably in a secluded leather booth at my favorite downtown jazz bar. The lighting was dim, the music was soft, and the first sip of my vintage red wine tasted like pure victory. My personal cell phone vibrated on the table. The caller identification displayed the private, direct number of the Novus Terra Board of Directors. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the screen. Bennett Dynamics, I answered, my voice smooth and relaxed. It was the chief executive officer, the same man who, just yesterday, was ready to sacrifice my entire career to protect a foolish executive. Now, his arrogant voice was noticeably trembling. He sounded defeated, exhausted, and desperate. He started rambling, offering a hollow apology for the unfortunate misunderstanding with Sterling, and then, completely stripped of his leverage, he practically begged me to renegotiate the profit-sharing ratios in the new contract. He pleaded that the current margins would severely hurt their quarterly projections. I took another slow sip of my wine and turned my head to look out the window. The beautiful, sprawling skyline of Chicago was just beginning to light up against the twilight sky. I am sorry, but the terms are non-negotiable, I replied, smiling into the phone. In fact, considering the sheer level of technical incompetence I will have to supervise from your teams, My independent consulting fee just tripled. I want the newly signed agreement sitting in my inbox before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, or I will gladly take this entire $80 million project across the street to your biggest competitor. I did not wait for his response. I pressed the red button, completely ending the call, and officially finishing the game. Hello, everyone. I want to take a moment to sincerely thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. I would love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Please let me know in the comments. If you found today's story entertaining and want to help us keep this channel alive, please consider joining our Patreon. Over there, you can listen to our very best, exclusive true revenge stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the Patreon link down in the description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next one.